All right, so integral in a nutshell. First of all, what's my relationship to it? I moved to Boulder for circling for something that had heart, and then all my friends who lead circling say, "Oh, it's an integral practice," and then so I checked it out, and it was very dry and theoretical, lots of maps. I was like, "Fuck this! I'm not into it." But they actually, so Decker, who started Circling and Authentic Relating, started the Integral Center with Robert McNaughton, who was working with Ken Wilber, and they actually brought the aliveness of circling, the interpersonal space, intersubjective space that integral kind of forgets to have a heart. I mean, they have a heart, but they forget to like relate with each other because they're very theoretical. And to me, so to me, integral was this theory that I was just like, yeah, it sounds kind of nice, but I'm not, I'm into living. And then I participated, I hung out, and I actually heard the guy who actually owns that building that they used to have for the Integral Center give a keynote, and he said like, is a 9-year-old just a broken 12-year-old? And I got it. Or like somebody else said, like integral is about fundamental incompleteness. Nobody's 100% right, including me. Nobody's 100% wrong, including Trump and who votes for them. So what do those two things have in common? There's a sense that trusting in a developmental arc and a slow positive arc of progress, and in letting people be where they are while also saying like, hey, and there's a natural hierarchy of development where there's growth. So a 9-year-old is not a broken 12-year-old. That does not mean that the 12-year-old doesn't have capacities that a 9-year-old so a 12-year-old does indeed have capacities that the 9-year-old doesn't have. So a 12-year-old is more complex. And a 9-year-old, if 3 years later he's still a 9-year-old, then something went wrong. There's actually like development that needs to happen from that. But also, a 9-year-old is not wrong for being a 9-year-old. And sometimes I think our society, especially in the education system, we just like push people. Like every time I see that third grade reading level for, like, that's fucking insane to pretend that there's some standard, right? So like our whole school system is actually totally violent and not integral. But there's that care. That's like, yeah, what, like the 9-year-old is actually more fundamental than a 12-year-old. And there's this all like, instead of having domination hierarchies, which is what people are afraid of, we have natural hierarchies or holarchies, where we try to both be in love with a thing or the person as it is, and encourage it to grow. So integral has a bunch of maps of knowledge. It has the quadrants, the lines of development, states and stages. But really the thing it's most known for is the levels of development, which apply to humans and societies. And there's the first tier, which has six places, second tier, which is the integral tier, and then there's even the third tier, which is basically a non-dual, and theoretically can go up. But the last four of the first year are really interesting. So from red, and they each have some colors. Spiral dynamics is like loosely related, has slightly different colors, but I use the integral ones from the Ken Wilber does. So red is angry, setting boundaries, like aggressive, and in societies it's feudalism. And so actually the integral, once you get to the second tier, where like, we try not to throw out the baby with the bathwater. We trust that there's wisdom at every level. Like integral actually has the ability to go into go into red, and actually use force and anger to protect something that's near and dear. When we get to the hippies, the green level, they're so like ours, blind basically to our view of the world is the only true one, that they can't imagine that there's anything useful at red. So Trump is there's a beautiful podcast episode by Jeff Saltzman, who used to own the Integral Center building, where he talks about red Trump. So like, yeah, what attracts people to Trump? It's because he doesn't negate this real fundamental need to have anger, to have aggression, to like clear out a boundary. Obviously, shit ton of ways that can go wrong, and it has, and it does with Trump. But if you want to understand why people vote for Trump, you have to understand how our green kind of postmodern society has totally like lost the ground when it comes to that. Also lost the ground when it comes to the next level, which is amber, which is surrendering to structure. Now these alternate um, from agency to communion, agency communion. So red is obviously selfish. And then amber says, okay, too much selfishness. We need to surrender to some larger structure. So that's usually church, military, a more structured society. And in that place, like, um, what's value? Like tradition, like it's a very conservative place. How can we, the Inquisition was also part. So obviously it can have its abuses, like the 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 collective oppressing the individual. So after a little while, like we need to fight against that too. So the orange comes online, which is industrial revolution, enlightenment. Let's think about things. Let's measure things. Let's let the individual achieve their own goals. Um, so that's capitalism. That's modern. The amber is also called traditional. So capitalism modern is what we mostly have in the world today. Even schools, my friend who runs the Reinventing Education podcast, he says that there's three levels of schools going on at the same time: traditional, modern, and postmodern. And mostly it's like a modern school with either traditional or postmodern values. Um, so so from the modern perspective, like we want to have success financial, but it also has wars and everything. So again, you try to, from an internal perspective, I say like, what's the wisdom in surrendering to a greater power? What's the wisdom in actually like paying your bills and measuring stuff, which is what, and being intellectual, which is what orange does. But the hippie world, the green, which is like near and dear to me and to all of us, like that's where the joy is, like where we care about each other, we build community, and it's so wonderful, and it's also so blind to the other three levels, and it falls short. It's like you can see the hippies like failing in spite of their like beautiful goals and ideals, because they're not paying the bills, because they can't wake up on time and offer something in a structured way, because they can't access their own power through aggression. So when you get to, so that's green, and there's a giant gap between the leap between first tier and second tier is so big and so important. So can you actually like hang out at the second tier where you're actively seeking, like, how is the Trump voter right? Like asking that question. So the last time I led a connection games leadership training, actually, like, I really wanted us to study integral as the foundation of it. And I still kind of want that, but because ultimately in connection is an integral practice. You have multiple perspectives on the same thing. We appreciate each other, but we also offer dark reflections, and we use our bodies, we use all our minds and hearts and so on. But I think that I was saying this in answer to like your daughter saying that you bring too much of the hippie stuff, right? So what does that mean? Like, yeah, if it's the American left basically losing touch with more than half the American public, and unable to actually like speak to meet them. And what's actually true for, as a dance teacher, I like to ask the question, between the leader and the follower, whose job is it to create the good dance? And it's actually a trick question, because it's the job of the more experienced dancer to create the good dance. It's your responsibility because you're more evolved. So if the green level, if the hippies are truly more evolved, great, demonstrate it by going and talking to people who have different values than you, because it's not going to be the voters from Trump land are not going to come in and understand trans rights, and it's hard. It's a really hard problem, right? It's really frustrating, but it's the only hope is for us to actually like increase our empathy or compassion. We were having that conversation earlier, but like to increase our compassion to actually include the people who don't think like us, and from that space we can actually engage in dialogue. But if I'm lost in my hippie values, like, I'm doomed, because certainly people who are at a lower level of development, one of the truths about this developmental theory is like every level is blind to everything above it. So they can only see the past, and everything else seems like weird or scary. An example is from orange. So from the rational, like, in capitalist view, anything with energy healing is like You guys are like spiritual mumbo jumbo, like the mythical level, which is the second, actually the second of the six first year levels. But actually, like, I don't know, I used to be at a rational level, and then I went to energy healing school, and there's some stuff that's happening that I cannot explain with all the science I learned in high school, which is so inferior anyway to real science, right? When you actually look at real science, some of these things become a lot more gray zone. But that idea of the, like, there's something greater is also like, there's something I don't know. So the more you go into this fundamental, like, the beauty of not knowing, the beauty of maybe, that's what integral is about. And I think if we in our lovely hippie communities can actually open up to not knowing more, and especially include in our not knowing some of the things that we really fear from the other side, then I think there's more chance for all of us to get along.